As members of the Texas TriCities Chapter, we will recall that before the pandemic began in the spring of 2020, the energy industry was already facing strategic challenge. In fact, there's probably no other industry undergoing more significant transformation today than oil and gas. Many of the major players have announced a shift toward renewables, and activist investors are increasing pressure on ESG strategy. The conversation begins with sustainability reports, DE&I commitments, and an overall change in the relationship between enterprise and society. It's now moving its way into metrics and accountability. As a result, compensation committees today face the challenge of aligning incentives with strategic direction while making sure that executive pay is aligned with shareholder rewards. We have a great panel today to address that topic relative to the oil and gas sector. Their bios have all been made available to you, but I'll give a short introduction for each person. Tasha Murphy is Vice President of Human Resources in Newpark. Prior to joining Newpark, she worked at Anadarko Petroleum Corporation. In her 8 years at Anadarko, Tasha held leadership positions across HR, managed various HR business partner and center of excellence teams. She has extensive global experience across many areas in HR, as well as living abroad in China, England, and Italy. Gary Adams is a member of the board of directors of Phillips 66. He serves on the Human Resource and Compensation Committee, as well as the Public Policy and Sustainability Committee. Gary had a career in the chemical industry with Union Carbide and Chemical Market Associates, Inc. In CMAI, he served as president, CEO, and chairman of the board until its acquisition by IHS in 2011. In addition to his directorship at Phillips 66, Gary serves as a director of Tricor Resources and previously served on the board of Westlake Chemical. Wes Hart is a managing director in the Houston office of Pearl Meyer and Partners. His focus has been on assessment and development of executive compensation programs with an emphasis on tailoring incentive programs to the individual needs of clients. Wes previously was a manager at Buck Consultants in the executive compensation practice and also held positions at Mercer and KPMG. Our moderator today is Ian Keys, a principal at Pearl Meyer. His experience is predominantly in that of the energy industry, focusing on E&P and oil field service, but also includes banking and nonprofit. Prior to joining Pearl Meyer, Ian spent nearly 10 years with Longnecker & Associates. His last position was practice leader for advisory services in the Rocky Mountain region. With that, I'll turn the virtual podium over to Ian. It's all yours, Ian.
Thank you, Anna. And thank you everyone for joining. Really excited to have a really good discussion. We've got some great panelists here between Tasha and Gary and Wes and myself a little bit to help sort of frame the conversation around compensation and how you can leverage that to encourage or incentivize transformation. So we have a great conversation lined up that will dig into how energy companies are leveraging the comp programs to support business transformation in what is, as Anna laid out, an extremely transformative time for the industry. Companies are juggling issues from attracting or retaining talent to responding to the seemingly constantly new pressures from ESG or encouraging transformation initiatives. So it feels like today's market is particularly complex for those that are involved in the compensation program design process. I think I read an article recently that talked about how the Audit Committee chair used to be the toughest job within the board, and that seems to have shifted to a degree to the Compensation Committee chair. So I think we're seeing that in real time. Between our dialogue and the volume of questions we received from the audience prior to today, I think we've got a great conversation and hope we can all take away some valuable insights to bring back to your respective organizations. So with that, I thought we would just go ahead and dig right into the first topic here. And Tasha, I'm going to come to you first. Attraction and retention of talent is something that those involved in compensation are constantly thinking about from a philosophical perspective. But you've been really, really hands-on with sort of managing that sort of dynamic within your organization. And we'd love to hear just some sort of high-level thinking or thoughts around, what you have seen in your organization with respect to retaining the talent you do have, and also attracting that new talent that's going to help your organization in future years.
Absolutely, Ian. Thank you. I'm really happy to be here, and absolutely from a retention standpoint, we in the HR community are in the trenches right now from an oil and gas sector standpoint. So I think it's really important, when organizations have their exit survey data, to really be leaning on the data and these sorts of things. We hear a lot of anecdotal data, whether that's through state interviews or through our exit surveys of where employees' heads are at. There is a lot of consternation in the industry right now, but some of our pockets are seeing more increased anxiety than others. Thankfully, I think because of our culture and the value proposition that we offer, we haven't seen any sort of exodus, but in any of the conversations, whether it be via COVID, the oil and gas downturn, we are talking to our employees a lot more. And I know that a lot of my HR professional colleagues and other companies are as well. And I think just staying close to your workforce in these times is really, really important. And also being agile as much as you can and seeing what can be done creatively from a cost solution standpoint, but then also really taking a hard look at your compensation programs to make sure that you are aligned and able to deliver the shareholder value while also making sure you retain the talent that we've all worked very hard to have.
Very good, very good. And Gary, a question to you that's sort of on this topic of retention and attraction of talent, right? We've seen this sort of we've heard about in the news right around the Great Resignation, right? And in certain areas of in the energy industry, in job duties are very people are skilled for very specific skills, but we've seen and Wes, I'll come to you after this, a little bit of anecdotal data around some of those key administrative functions, whether it be finance or legal. I'd be curious to hear your perspectives, more from the downstream side of the equation around what you all have seen from a retention of talent standpoint, and how maybe your organization high level has responded to those concerns.
Thank you, Ian. Really appreciate this opportunity to share my personal views, these important topics such as attracting and retaining talent. And I continuously benefit from these materials and advice I get from NACD and Meyer. But before I get in, just a quick reminder that these are my opinions and not necessarily the opinions of any of the boards or committees on which I serve. So there's the Surgeon General's warning. So take it for what it is. I step back and look at this and think about all the years that I've been associated with the energy industry in a very broad sense, all the way upstream through downstream and petrochemicals. And I can't think of a more exciting time that we have right now. Transformation is ahead of us. Conversion is ahead of us. Participation in the change in an industry that's so important to people around the world is something I think that attracts talent. And so I actually see it, and I hear this through various contacts as well, that it is a great time to be in the industry. It may not feel that way if you're sitting in the upstream side, but even that's beginning to transition. It's a time of consolidation. It's a time of opportunity for those who participate. So I think that you balance that with ESG initiatives as well as diversity and inclusion initiatives. And I'd say, where else would you rather be? So I think that we find people in the culture engaged. I think we find them excited about creating the future. So I think that, and I also see that talent can move across certainly these sectors, and it does, it easily does, across the energy sectors. So I feel optimistic about the future in terms of attracting and retaining.
Very good, very good. And Wes, you work with so many clients right across sort of all segments of the industry. I'd be curious to hear your perspectives and what you are seeing in your day-to-day with respect to the retention of talent, the attraction of new talent, how your clients are managing those sort of circumstances and some of the maybe high level approaches they're putting in place to deal with those matters on a go forward basis.
Thanks, Ian. And obviously this has been a big topic in the boardroom this year. And again, I'm happy to be here on the call today. But I think when we think about attraction and retention, I mean, compensation, which is what we do for a living, Ian and I, is just one small part of that equation. I think communicating a strategic vision and echoing what Gary just said, having excitement, there's a lot of change going on in the industry. We're looking to be greener companies by and large, and those things can get exciting. I think people can come attracting new talent to this industry to make things better. I mean, for the environment and for everything else. And these are exciting times with a lot of change. We need new thoughts, new vision, new talent. And I think that's where attraction and retention starts, really communicating that strategic vision to get people excited to come to work, excited to come to work for you. Building upon and getting back to compensation, I think there's been a lot of turmoil, a lot of change happening the last couple of years with COVID and everything else and the low oil price environment we've had over the time. And I think we've made a lot of changes to compensation. And part of what we need to do now is rest in those changes and see how those things, the current changes and the stock prices have rebounded some, how things really are. So we've had some stock price increments in many cases. We've changed the bonuses. We've added new features to those things. Let's let them pay out as they're designed to see if that's working for us to retain our talent and keep them going. With the stock price increases, let's see if that's working for us. But I think, I mean, one of the questions we get asked is, should we put in some kind of retention plan for our rank and file for our executives? I think for the rank and file, it's really a case by case situation. When you have a situation on the ground where you're having trouble keeping people, and Natasha could comment on that. But for the executive team, I think the starting place is to keep granting competitive grants on an annual basis, hope the stock prices rise and let things fall where they may. But if there are strategic changes happening and you need to do more, you can think about designing extra programs on top of things, but only if there's really some key strategic initiative happening to look forward to what's going to happen. If it's just, you don't want to give retention grants to your executives just because it's been a bad day or a bad week or a bad year. There's got to be some story around that. You know, we had a CEO succession. We need to retain people. Absolutely makes sense. We've got a strategic initiative where we're changing the whole focus of the company. Retention grants might make sense, or some special awards make sense. But it's harder to argue we've had bad times, we want to give our executives some big retention grant. That falls flat with, I think, the investor base. That's kind of where we are. You know, I don't know if you have any follow-up comment yourself also.
You know, I would agree with that entirely. I think in the realm of transformation, right? I mean, it takes many forms in today's market, whether that be, you know, business strategy or your workforce, right? Sort of a transformation of your workforce. We saw, you know, a significant reduction in sort of headcount, right? In the last 12 months as companies responded to COVID pressures and the like. And so you've really seen, you know, you've seen transformation on multiple fronts here. And I think you touched on a lot of topics that we'll dig into a little bit more around, you know, trending metrics and the use of retention and the like. And so, yeah, I think from you know, as companies look to engage on these transformative efforts, you have to have programs in place that are going to retain that talent they do have in the house, but also be looking towards the future of, you know, how do you attract that future, you know, educated professional to the workforce when, you know, as we've all seen, sort of the data suggests that interest is waning in the energy industry overall. So it's a bit of, you know, setting that comp program correctly and marketing your organization, your future correctly as well to create a good recipe. So Tasha, I want to maybe carry this one a little bit forward with you around, you know, when we talk about retention of the team, you know, in these times of transformation, you know, have you seen within your workforce, or are you guys doing anything, or, you know, around maybe the rebalancing of you know, compensation elements, right? And I'm thinking, you know, salaries and cash bonuses and long-term incentives, right? Are you seeing any pressures either within your organization or more broadly or across your competitors to maybe take another look at those in designing them correctly to retain that workforce through this time period?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And it's definitely something that we're looking at. we haven't made any hard and fast decisions, but I can tell you, kind of weaving into some of the comments that were just made, and then also connecting to this question, you know, in the role that I am sitting in, and I know this is the case for a lot of other CHROs or leads of HR, we are on more benchmarking calls than I think I have ever been on from an external standpoint. I've been in a couple of CHRO type webinars for specific topics, and of course, this is one that's really, really hot. And I think it's really HR's job, and it's part of our role to be looking at all of that data, be getting the shareholder feedback from our, you know, investor relations, finance team, the GCs, whoever are talking to those shareholders, and really evaluating the data across the board. Something that, you know, a comment that was just made, kind of that Wes made, not making those retention decisions kind of on knee-jerk or fear-based reactions, I think is really important, but really grounding yourself in the data, and then also keeping a really keen eye on the benchmarking that is happening out in the market, whether that is topically for attraction and retention, because labor has been an issue as well, or if it's on specific compensation elements. And I think for us, you know, when I talk to other colleagues in the industry, and I know we are as well, we are really looking hard at the data to see if there is anything in our mix that we need to take a look at. But I think for now, what we're really focused on is, you know, making sure our employees know that they are valued, and from an instilling calm standpoint from an HR leader to the workforce, really trying to just maintain, hey, let's focus, let's be safe, let's focus on our core values and culture, and those good things will come. Because I agree with Gary, it is a really, as hard as it has been, it is a really exciting and pivotal time to be in the industry, and there's a lot of impact that employees can make, and really contributing to, you know, the ESG type conversation and the culture. And so I think when we talk about the specific elements of compensation, we are always going to come back to the data, talk to Meyer in this case, and other external benchmarking to see what's happening there because of our compensation philosophy. So
very good. Thank you. So you mentioned ESG, right? Sort of in that response, and I want to shift the conversation to there, because that was sort of the onset of the ESG focus, you know, from the investor market was the sort of the first, you know, pin to drop in terms of what's created a very transformative period, right? And you had COVID quickly kind of come after that, and then you had a smattering of things kind of all combined. So Gary, this question is going to come to you in sort of your views around, you know, the industry and how it has responded to date to ESG pressures. You know, I'd be curious to hear, you know, there's always the values versus value conversation, right, when it comes to compensation design. And I'll use the term values to sort of, you know, summarize sort of ESG, and then value in terms of generating shareholder value, whether that be in share price, you know, returns to shareholders and the like. I'd love to get your perspective on, you know, how the industry to date has responded to those concerns in the sense of, you know, compensation design, and how that you have seen or not seen that impact sort of ESG performance, you know, kind of after that, to see if there's a linkage or a relationship.
Great, Doug. Those are really important topics. I think the first kind of higher level key is to recognize that there is a transition occurring from value investing to values investing. That's not original by me. I picked that up in some material I was working through the other day. But we're into a period of time where values become an important criteria in investing strategy. So the compensation programs in place then have to continue to be designed and ensure that they're aligned with corporate strategy. So it comes back to corporate strategy. The compensation program is the cart, not the horse. The horse is the corporate strategy. So it's the corporate strategies that have to be transitioning as well to incorporate that shareholder values criteria. So the ultimate goal, obviously, is still to enhance shareholder value, but you have to have a values, ESG, et cetera, focus to create additional value for your shareholders. And And the compensation programs, therefore, while not throwing everything out just because we're in the period of transition, have to morph towards more of a recognition and rewards program for performance that corporate performance that fits that strategy, especially as it relates to those values criteria. This industry, ESG, environmental, is one that begins with environmental. This industry doesn't continue to exist. These companies are not successful unless they have a keen focus on environmental and safety factors. So that's been a part of, for years, of the performance reward system. Certainly now, with the importance of culture and the importance of understanding various social pressures, et cetera, those have to come in as well. And so compensation committees are reviewing and initiating means by which to judge, recognize, and reward progress towards longer-term strategic goals in those values that are becoming more and more important to our investors.
So thank you, Gary. So, and Wes, sort of over to you. I think some of what Gary just said sort of aligns with some of our thinking around, your compensation program should be an extension of your business strategy, right? So I'm curious with sort of a broader perspective across your client base, how have your clients and things that you've seen, how have they responded to the sort of the ESG pressures in terms of compensation programs, and maybe anecdotally, are they seeing sort of the benefits of those programs, program changes sort of on their ESG performance?
I mean, I think as a comp practitioner, one of the main things I would say, your incentive plans, particularly the annual incentive plan, is one of the best ways to communicate to the world what's important to you, what's important to the executive team, what you want to be important to them. So I think as we add ESG metrics to the overall scorecard that we look at for monitoring our executive performance, I think it tells the street that's important. And I definitely think adding those things, bringing those things to the forefront definitely has increased that sort of march down the road toward our longer term goals of being, more sustainable, smaller carbon footprint, more diverse companies with our workforce and our management teams and things like that. I think at the beginning, one of the questions, and looking at the list of questions we got before this call, what's the right metric to use? I think that's not a single answer. It's your strategic answer that would affect that and what you're trying to do as a company. But I think one of the starting points I've seen work well at several clients really is the idea of creating some kind of a scorecard around ESG, communicating to the street that we've got an ESG scorecard we're tracking. We're going to hold management accountable for making improvements incrementally on the scorecard. And it may be a very qualitative process, but that's going to be a piece of their bonus. And so that's sort of the base case that I've seen work pretty well, both in terms of communicating to the street what we're trying to do and in terms of motivating people to think about these things in an important fashion.
So a couple of things you said there I want to maybe dig into a little bit further, right? One is you mentioned, and we had a lot of questions, leading up to this around what are the prevalent metrics, right? What are companies doing? So I wonder if you maybe you could provide a little bit of insight around what you've seen in terms of, there's the scorecard approach, but what are the specific metrics that you generally have seen, that and how that might align or differ from broader industry practices?
Sure. I think, one of the things we've seen, and as Gary mentioned, this industry has always had environmental goals built into the incentive programs and safety goals built into the incentive programs. And if you look at a broad study of who's using ESG, energy is at the top of that list because those things are already there. So as we think about the new ESG concept and what people mean when they say that, it really is around primarily diversity initiatives and carbon footprint and sustainability initiatives. So the thing that we've seen added to that, and not so much to the incentive plans, but to the things we're tracking, and maybe the next step would be to start adding those to incentive plans, would be those newer things. So I think right now, environmental measures is the main thing we see across most companies and having some focus on that. And they always have, and they're making that focus stronger, maybe a bigger piece of the bonus. The safety metrics are still there. The other things that are sort of emerging, I have some data that I brought with me today. We did a larger oil and gas study of proxies from last year. And roughly, as we counted, 10% of the oil and gas companies as some kind of climate-based ESG goal in the incentive plan. So it's a small percentage, but it's emerging. On the diversity and inclusion side, in our study, it was 6% of energy companies had a diversity goal in their incentive plan. Again, it's emerging. It's hard to create quantitative goals around some of those things, but 3 years ago it would have been 0. So 0 to 6 to 10 to 12 to 15. I mean, that's going to keep tracking forward. So those are the kind of things to think about. Climate, diversity, sustainability. Those are the things that are coming. But right now, it's environmental, it's safety, it's employee engagement. Those things are already there.
Yeah. The other piece of that, I think it maybe is helpful context for the audience is maybe a little bit around, when companies when they make the determination that, look, an ESG element needs to be within our incentive schemes, right? That's the messaging we want to have to the market. We want to reward our teams for accomplishing those goals. Are you seeing those more in the short-term incentives versus the long-term incentives? And I think I know the answer to that, so I'll do a follow-up question for those that maybe you have seen within the long-term incentives. How should companies be thinking about that?
We're definitely seeing it show up in the short-term incentives for now. And one of the ways, and I think I'll get to your other question before you even ask it, one of the things we see, aligning with what Gary said, we've got long-term goals, we want to achieve, whether it's carbon footprint or environmental, no spills, no releases, whether it's diversity goals. We've got longer term aspirations in those areas. So one might think, well, that should be a long-term goal. But what I might say back to you is, no, we want to have a stepwise process. So step 1 of that long-term goal is in the annual plan this year. Step 2 will be in the annual plan next year. And that's what we're seeing as people get more thoughtful about these things. I think that's the way to go.
Very good. Tasha, Gary, anything you want to add to that?
Oh, sure. But Wes and I have a number of discussions on this, as well as others. It's connected. Your ability to retain, attract talent is connected to the culture and the effectiveness of your programs that you have put in place, whether it's on sustainability or human capital management. And while you can stepwise measure that year to year, and certainly you have to consider doing that in your annual programs, consider weight you might put on that factor versus financial or other operational factors, and adjust those importance, that weighting factor as you go forward. But in the longer term plan, your total shareholder return is going to be a function of how effective you've been in creating the culture and diversity and the transition that your strategy represents. So it's connected. It has to be connected, or the plans are not as effective.
Yeah, I agree. I think, something that Gary said absolutely resonates with me and what we're seeing, that, this is all connected. This matters from an attraction and retention standpoint. We know when we look across some of the generational demographics and what's important to some of those demographics is that ESG, while it might be, a buzzword that has popped up in the last couple of years, those topics and these topics have been around for a while. And to the point, the oil and gas industry has historically done well on leading in some of those safety focus areas, really paying attention to the environment side. And so there might be companies out there who might be doing some of these things already and maybe just haven't marketed them in an effective way. And so I think it's going through, aligning with the strategy, which I think is always really important, aligning with the shareholders, making sure you're having those conversations in the shareholder outreach for what they're looking for as well, and then applying what your company is doing and then also what you want to be doing. And Wes, I think the step process that you talked about would be really effective in looking at those goals.
Very good. Very good. Yeah, I know there were some questions from the audience around, sort of in the preliminary questions around, what are the prevailing practices, right? So I think if I could summarize this, for those that are putting sort of the ESG context into their incentives, it's predominantly focused around the E, right? The environmental piece and the safety. We're seeing it mostly in the short-term incentives, and to the tune of maybe up to 20% of that total scorecard, right? So seems to be where data that Wes and I have seen where things seem to be sort of aggregating around. So Okay, I want to move forward here. We've got about 20 minutes left. I want to make sure we've got some time for some Q&A with the audience here. But a third sort of general topic that we sort of talked about preliminarily was using those incentive levers to support transformation, right? And as I mentioned before, transformation takes many sort of forms in the energy space, whether it be business strategy, restructurings, new ventures, new enterprises, workforce transitions. It's very broad in terms of how you could apply a definition to the space. So whether that be engaging in efforts to support net zero, exploring new products and services, remaking organizations. We talked earlier about retention and attraction of talent. So I'd love to hear insights from anybody in the group around how these transformation initiatives are being supported from a compensation standpoint. So Wes, I'll start with you this time around, and how would you, with a pretend client, right, that's going through transformation, how would you guide them through the thought process around how you can use incentives to as a leverage to encourage transformation?
Right, and I'll keep this one brief, and we can build on it if we have time. But I think the key thing is starting with vision of where the company wants to go. What's the transformation look like, and how big a change is this? And assuming it's a big change that's happening where we're adding a whole third or half of our company is going to be a different company in a year or two or three, I think it's important to first have your plan of milestones and things, strategic things you're trying to achieve within that transformation. And I think the first place to start within the compensation realm, it's similar to what I said about ESG, but it's slightly different in that you've got milestones you want to have. Over the next 5 years, we're going to add X amount of revenue in this new area of green energy, whatever it is you're doing. We're going to do something different now. So you're going to have some milestones around that. And I think you carve out, that you limited real estate in the annual incentive plan. You carve out a piece of the annual incentive plan to be focused on those milestones and achieving, again, the stepwise process against those milestones. These are different kinds of milestones. These are milestones that are going to create massive shareholder value, theoretically. That's what we're doing in this transformation, to get the share price double to triple over the next 10 years. So these are milestones to get us on that track to achieve this complete strategic transformation of the company. So it's unlike environmental goals, which are values. This is a value generating goals series. And you set, again, stepwise progress against those milestones. They're going to transform the company into a new company. And you have those in the annual incentive plan. So if you think about it as a pie, so maybe 50-60% of your pie is current cash flows, EBITDA, whatever you think of. The next 20 to 25% could be these milestones to transform the company, and the remaining 10, 20, 15% would be the values piece, the ESG piece. And it's not that easy. I mean, they're making this like a recipe where it's perfectly exactly this. No, it depends on your situation, but that's the idea. Yeah,
well said. Tasha, Gary, anything to add to what Wes sort of laid out in terms of how you might potentially approach that dynamic?
I think from our standpoint, similar to a comment I made earlier, is we always kind of come back to what our comp philosophy is. And then to Wes's point, we're trying to reinforce what we want to see from a performance standpoint, right? And so I think it's really critical to remain true to your comp philosophy, but also be evaluating the different levers that we have available to us from a compensation payment standpoint, what you're trying to reinforce, and then create the mix in a way that you think will drive that ultimate value back to the shareholders.
It obviously needs to be transparent, and it needs to be well communicated. The transformation strategies you have underway. I'm sure in almost any investor meeting, the question comes up, what are you doing to transform this company? What are you doing to transform your business? How are you going to meet various goals that have been presented to the different sectors? And all through the sector, how are you going to continue to even exist? We're not anything like we were 10 years ago or 20 years ago, regardless of which company this is. But I'll say this one more time: compensation programs, the incentive programs have to get the strategy. So if the strategy's not right, the compensation program and incentives. That's I think is critical going forward.
Thank you for that. So, and Wes, back over to you. You mentioned sort of the, I think we're all sort of aligned around the philosophy that your comp program should reflect your business strategy, and if that strategy includes transformation, rewarding for achieving milestones along the way to make that transformation a reality. But we think back to proxy advisory firms, and you think about activist investors, right? Engine number one, Kimmeridge, and the like. There's a certain lens that companies are judged upon, when the external market goes and looks at, what did you do for the prior year from a compensation standpoint, and how does that affect say on pay votes? How does that affect re-election votes for directors, right? So in the context of from that perspective, and we think about, hey, these are additional efforts beyond sort of your legacy operations, or maybe what keeps the lights on in terms of operations and products and services. Do you think is there room for sort of these transformational linked incentives to be toppers over and above your typical target comp opportunity, right? Or is this something that needs to be woven into sort of a static comp opportunity, and it just becomes part of that design?
I mean, the short answer is it really depends. It depends on your situation and the level of change you're having. And if the change is extreme enough, I think it could make sense to add a topper on top of the comp plan, where it's an additional piece of pay. One time, I'll call it extra piece of comp that would be leading you to the transformation. That wouldn't be where I would start, though. I would start with no, it's part of the existing pay mix. It just becomes a piece of the pay mix, and we hope that these things are all going to be incremental value creators, so the stock price rises accordingly. And I think one other area that I didn't mention in the first bit of this conversation is there can be a temptation for carving certain people out if you're starting a new unit up that's going to do something special, or carving certain people out that are sort of in hot areas like IT or legal. And we've debated those things around the boardroom table many times. But I think as I thought about it more before this conversation today, I think it's important that most companies develop sort of a one team mentality. I don't think it's good to pay your transformation group over here a lot more at a higher percentile level than you pay your regular executives or whatnot. I think it's better to have that be part of the overall corporate whole. I mean, there may be exceptions to that depending on what you're trying to do. That's the base case. Culture, and one team. We're going to go swing for the fences together, and we're going to do this thing, and we're going to get there. It's a better way to go if you can use that.
Yeah, I agree with you, Wes. I think there was a question that was submitted beforehand that was asking something along those lines, and what you just said is aligned with what I was thinking as well when I read that question. And Ian, to your question, if that transformation is something that culturally you want your whole company behind, then I think creating that subsection or even a different entity to accomplish those goals is maybe prolonging the inevitable to get the kind of culture change, that focus, that philosophy ingrained in what you want your company to be doing from the outset. So it might be harder in the shorter term to kind of, change the rudder up and change the direction a little bit. But I think in the long run, that provides better value.
And certainly you have opportunities to communicate this, not just to your organization, but outside your organization as well, when you go through such things as well created sustainability reports, updates to that frequently, and it gives the whole organization and the culture to move in unison towards accomplishing that. And in the end, the return on capital employed in the longer term incentives should reflect that, if in fact you're moving toward what investors see as the future transition necessary for this industry.
Very good, very good. So the one of the underlying themes from many of our questions that we got sort of prior to today were around what are we seeing in the marketplace, right? What are the trending data points? What are the metrics we're seeing companies put in place, and what do you expect to see sort of go forward in the next proxy season when companies disclose what they did for fiscal year 21? And I'm looking at the chat, and we did get a question in for Pearl Meyer, which I'll also open up to both Tasha and Gary if you have insights. But so Wes, to you, what percentage of short-term and long-term incentive plans are you seeing that are being sort of allocated for DEI or ESG purposes?
I mean, I think the whole ESG topic is getting about 20% in the annual plan and none of the long-term plan right now. That's the base case. And you get back to, you want to focus on value creation. You want to focus on actual successes. So you can have successes against ESG metrics too, but in terms of the blocking and tackling and generating cash for the company, I think we all agree that should be the lion's share of the incentives. So it's 20%. I don't mean to be long-winded. For the whole thing, the whole ESG. So that includes safety. Theoretically, it includes environmental. It includes diversity. And anything else you wanted to measure in that. I mean, maybe it'll grow to 25% if we keep adding new things to that topic. And one of the things I've seen happen is the ESG umbrella is subsuming safety also, and these other things that already existed before. So if safety was 10% before, now ESG is 20 or 25, and it includes the safety piece that used to be 10.
Yeah.
I'd support that completely, but I think that, one of the ways in which to make sure that the focus is appropriate is that while you may have had in place for a long time excellence in environmental and safety performance, I think by adding criteria around different ways you could define it, I'll just call it organizational excellence. And that speaks to an organization that is working ESG, working DEI, et cetera, but organizational excellence, it's a little bit more difficult to quantify. The metrics are a bit challenging, but you can see that in talent development and retention, in diversity across the organization, those profiles and how that changes as well. But so I think for this industry, which has been used to environmental and safety criteria for a long time, that addition of those organizational excellence, and you could call it different things, metrics is something that provides alignment across the organization.
Yeah, and I would just add, I think it came through one of the questions, but then I've also had discussions with other VP of HRs, CHROs, and in the external community in our industry. And for some, from a practical standpoint, agree some of those ESG metrics are easy to quantify and some may be less so, but you can always measure progress as well. Take the slice of where you are for whatever metric you want to measure within the E, S, or G, and then the next year measure the progress that you have made. And I think that from a relative standpoint also gives you an indicator of the focus too.
So Tasha, actually, within that sort of VP of HR, CHRO sort of network, right, that you have, I'd be curious, because while many of the folks on the phone or the board level, serving the comp committee, their oversight from a detail perspective sometimes tends to cap off at the executive level, right? From when you get below that line, are you seeing in your conversations, DE&I or ESG sort of flavors carrying down into rank and file incentive designs?
I would say we're definitely in the conversations that we're having. Absolutely. I know from a board focused standpoint, it's typically at that named executive officer level, but definitely with the conversations that I have with my peers across the industry, we are talking about that for the lower rank and file, for the general programs that we have in place, but also in relation to compensation. So.
Very good. Very good. So so in terms of other sort of trends that we're seeing from an ESG perspective, right? I think we have this interesting sort of balance between there's the desire for ESG to be communicated to the marketplace in terms of progress, whether that be through sustainability reports or inclusion in executive pay programs. right? I think some of those things are challenging. We talked about in terms of, how do you quantify them? However, on the flip side of this, you've got the industry has been sort of responding to or evolving from criticisms around there wasn't enough sort of rigor and quantitative measures in incentive schemes historically, and you saw you were seeing the results of that in terms of the shareholder experience was becoming increasingly separate from the executive experience in terms of pay outcomes. Right. I did a little study before, we got on the phone, and, we looked at data from fiscal 2020 in terms of bonuses. And, that includes, the start of sort of the ESG pressures. You've got the COVID impacts, but we saw, bonuses that were 75% or more of target, across the energy landscape. There was really, 50% or more of companies in all of those categories. If you look at the E&P companies, which have gotten a lot of the criticism, they were around 70% of companies that had bonuses at 75% of target or higher, right? So it certainly felt like the outcomes were a bit disconnected from other realities. So, Wes, any thoughts around the potential implications of, we want to respond to one set of criticism, but potentially exposing ourselves to others that are more on the activist side, which can have impacts for the directors listening on the phone in terms of their re-election votes.
Yeah, I think there've been a lot of, I think I mentioned this briefly before, but there've been a lot of changes to the bonus plans, particularly on the E&P side, where you've got more of a cash flow value generating concept in the annual incentive plans now than there used to be. I think we've had a lot of changes. Now we're going to see how those things work. And we've got to a place that's better alignment between share price outcomes and the actual incentive plan outcomes. And I think one of the things we're seeing, because we have had positive outcomes on both those things this year, we're expecting 2021 bonuses to be above target in general. So, but I think it's, as long as we have a program that we think is tied and linked to value creation, that should be okay. So we're hoping we don't have to have artificial cutbacks or anything. You can't pay above target this year because of XYZ. We're hoping 21 will be a year where we can let the chips fall where they may, and both the shareholders to some extent and the executives to another extent are satisfied with where that leads us. We're really hoping that's the case for 21. I don't know if I answered your question exactly, but that's part of it.
Yeah.
Could I add to that? That it's certainly important to continue to examine the composition of your longer term programs, especially as it relates to relative versus absolute results. I think there's two things evident. The shareholders expect more and more of the compensation to be performance based. They also expect a fair determination of not just relative performance against your peers, but absolute performance against metrics that ensure your progress towards return.
Agreed. Okay. So I want to give a chance. We sort of have covered some various elements of transformation, right, within the oil and gas context. But Tasha, Wes, Gary, any questions that you want to pose back to others on the panel or potentially the broader audience on any areas that you've been thinking about in this broader context?
I'd be interested in hearing more about the means by which people are creating sustainability and human capital management programs, and the means by which they're determining progress, how they're setting goals going forward.
So Tasha, maybe have any comments around human capital management and everything goes into that reporting and disclosure?
Yep, I would say this is definitely a conversation that we have on a fairly frequent basis with Wes and Pearl Meyer, as well as with our comp committee chair and our other comp committee members, our executive team. This is a very fluid conversation for us. We know that human capital has been more of a focus in the trend data that Pearl Meyer has shared with us. And I think thankfully, you know, from our company standpoint and others that I talk with and my peers across the organizations in the oil and gas industry, I think on the human capital side, HR teams have been working really hard on a lot of these human capital elements for a long time. So again, it's just highlighting what companies are already doing in these spaces, also focusing on those core values, those culture elements, whether it's in talent management or performance management. I really liked your comment, Gary, about, you know, really focusing on the performance there, whether that's for executives or for the workforce rank and file. I think HR teams across the country are working really hard on all of these aspects. And so where the trend seems to be, you know, that comp committees are looking more into these human capital topics, I think HR teams have a lot to say there and what's happening across the employee life cycle.
And one of the things I'd build on, again, you said earlier that the comp committee chair has become a harder job than the audit committee chair. I think the HR departments at companies is you need to have a strong HR team at your company. That's super important right now, more important than it's ever been. It's not gonna change. So I think, you know, whereas we see like the comp committee rising to be equal to or more important than the audit committee in some aspects, I think HR is rising to be more important than accounting in some aspects, and it's just really important to have a strong team in the HR house of your company. It's really, really important right now because you'll miss things. You'll wish you had that.
So we got about 5 minutes left here. So there's a couple of questions that come through in the chat. So I wanted to try to quickly sort of address those if we can. So the first one, and you know, whoever has sort of perspective, please feel free to chime in. But if strategy is primary to your compensation design process, what would be examples in the companies you are working with or working at of strategic changes that better capture value investing expectations? So Wes, I'm gonna call on you for this one, sort of what you have seen, you know, in terms of examples for strategic changes that better capture that value investing sort of perspective.
When you say, I mean, value investing, I mean, the build upon that a little bit, Ian. I know you're not the one asking the question, but
sure. Yeah. So I take this to sort of look at maybe how are companies responding to sort of the ESG oriented investing perspective, right?
Oh, I get it.
Yeah.
Sorry. I mean, I think all the companies that I work with and that I follow are legitimately trying to be good corporate stewards on the ESG side. This isn't lip service. We've gotten past that point. So I think it's important that, you know, everybody understand that, you know, the energy assets we have as a country are very important to our strategic, you know, going forward as a country, frankly, and we need to value those things, but everyone needs to be a good steward. And I think these things are starting to resonate with the investors as we do make progress, you know, and all the reporting that comes out of Sustainalytics and other companies that do such things. I think there is real progress being made if people are paying attention. The value investors should reopen their eyes. And I think we've seen with some of the stock price rebounds that we've seen this year, it's extremely important for a diversified investor to keep oil and gas in their portfolio. You're missing a big piece of what should be in your diversified portfolio if you don't do that. And if you've got blinders on if you're not doing things, and we're all rowing the boat the same direction.
Tasha, anything to add?
Ian, I was just going to add there, you know, when you look across those compensation programs and the different levers and the pay mix and all of those things, you know, this is where the art and science of compensation comes into play and what makes compensation really exciting. But, you know, there's opportunities to be creative if there's not a performance-based component in your cash program, for example. You know, a lot of folks have performance-based built into that LTI piece. That's a possibility to do as well in the cash side. So that might be something to consider from a practical application standpoint.
You bet. Yeah, and I would add to that question, right? So you certainly, there was the news yesterday, day before, around, you know, Pioneer Natural Resources and their net zero ambitions, right? And other larger organizations that are doing the same. You know, I think that you know, if you look at some of the majors, you know, they are, you know, they put the strategies in place in terms of transition and net zero goals. And what they are doing, as an example, is they're putting a portion of their long-term incentive at risk on the basis of achieving those goals, right? So they're definitely putting the largest piece of the pie, you know, more so at risk to meet those, you know, those objectives that are designed to sort of better capture that value investing market, right? So that's one way that you might want to look at it, depending on the size and scope of the organization, how you might look at approaching your comp design. So one other question I saw here was around so between the pandemic and sort of employee well-being surfacing in many conversations today, between management and the boardroom, is anyone seeing perspective or getting perspective on investors taking any interest in, sort of employee health as a metric, right? As well as a check the box for sustainability and social responsibility. So I think that question could be broken apart into two things. One, are you seeing or having conversations around, tracking that, tracking those measures, right? And two, are you seeing any sort of progress around putting those measures in incentive schemes, which, from the data that we can see so far, we haven't seen as much in terms of the employee engagement side of ESG. So any thoughts on that?
It suggests that if you don't have a robust employee survey program that is regularly performed and feedback provided and executed on the key issues, then you certainly better create one at this point. This was our first pandemic, wasn't it? We've been through hurricanes and freezes and things like that, but this was our first pandemic. And and congratulations to the employees, especially that marshaled these companies and supported these companies through these very trying times. But you better understand the impact it's had, and you can best do that, I think, through a rigorous and routine survey program, as well as all the feedback and town meetings and things like that.
It's super important to be measuring employee engagement right now. I don't know that it needs to be in all the incentive plans. It gets back to not everything you measure needs to be in the incentive plan, but it's super important to measure employee engagement. I think it's important to measure it across different diverse groups of people and see if there's a difference also. That's another thing that's really important. So if the females have a different perspective on the company than the males do, you need to know that. You need to know that. You need to deal with it.
Yeah, I agree. I think whether it's via survey, whether it's through your HR business partners, your leaders in each of your geographical locations, I think what people have experienced is varying by some of the different challenges that are happening all over the world with COVID, and also some of those norms. And even within the U.S., what's happening in some of our locations versus others is different. Field versus salary, et cetera. So I think more, Gary's point was great on the survey side, but also staying in close communication with your employees, using video, using different tools that you maybe need to stretch out of the comfort zone to use to make sure that your employees are hearing your messages, hearing from your leaders, and that employees feel heard as well.